do a sort of millennial thing and disrupt the agenda a bit, so apologies for that. We've got a list of 4 things I was going to cover here. I'll start with the bottom one rather than the top one: cynicism and skepticism. I will return to this theme, however, throughout the session on the webinar. So there's a bit of cynicism and a bit of skepticism that I've seen that continues in all industries about millennials. And I think it's driven by 2 things. Cynicism, because I think it's just seen as marketing bullshit, excuse my French. And skepticism, because I think people haven't yet seen the true value that millennials can bring to their specific jobs or careers or measurements. And I think both of those things are dangerous. And one of the things I say to clients is, you can continue to put your head in the sands, but by 2020, half of the world will be millennials, the global workforce. And the UK have 15 million millennials, and their behavior is significantly different as a group to the behavior of previous generations, driven primarily by tech. So it's a serious thing to take seriously, if that makes sense. And I'll come back and talk about cynicism and skepticism again. I'd ask yourself a question in true honesty. Are you a bit cynical? Are you a bit skeptical about millennials? And I'm open to any questions as we go along about that. In fact, I welcome them. Let's go back to the beginning as intended. So a bit of history, I'm going to whiz through this because it may bore people, but the reality of it is that the term millennials is bandied around a lot. I actually had a conversation with the marketing director of Carlsberg about 2 months ago, and he said, "Oh, stop you there. There are 2 words that send a chill down my spine in marketing. One is millennials and the other is digital." We then went on to famously get on and, we do work with them on millennials and everything else. But I thought it was an interesting statement from a marketing director of a leading brand, £1 billion in the UK alone, in that those 2 things are so overused, but they're overused for a reason, because they're critically important to the development and evolution of marketing and consumerism in the world. So one thing is saying, let's be, that's a bit trite, that's a cliche, but those things become cliches and trite for sound reasons. The history of the terminology comes from a guy called William Strauss and a partner called Neil Ho in 1987. No surprises here, American. And it was America that really drove the terminology, as they have with previous terminologies like baby boomers. And it's in the lexicon now as a sort of a marketing terminology that is so pervasive that it can annoy people. I say, forget the terminology, even though we've launched and own a brand called Millennial Jury that is very successful and a lot of people are dialing into. The term millennials for me is just code. It's a shortcut for young people who were born, who are now aged between 36 and 16, 35 and 16. Basically, anyone under the age of 35, we need to think about slightly differently. And I think, don't get hung up on the language. But just to clarify a bit of that, the US marketeers started this segmentation. And without going back too far, like sort of Second World War, post or First World War, the ones we probably know best are the baby boomers, probably our parents' generation. They're the lucky ones, they've had it easy. So they're aged between sort of 50 and 70 loosely. Then comes my generation, Generation X, 36 to sort of 50. And then, of course, the millennials, as we're talking about, 16 to 35. Now, I've got one of my 3 sons is a millennial, and he exhibits all these traits. And, I'd ask, I'm sure you will, some of you listening in will have children in that millennial bracket. And it'd be interesting to you to sort of partly think about them and their behaviors as this progresses. And then the latest generation to be really sort of touted and mooted in marketing circles about how we how people consume are Generation Z. I have two of those in my family, and this is they're supposed to represent a bit more of a caring attitude, less selfish than the millennials. And what's fascinating is they would be the first generation that have only known the digital world as it is now. You know, removing Wi-Fi from their life is like removing food. And then there is this latest generation being talked about, which is slightly weird. And this is, I guess, in brackets, where marketing lets itself down a bit. The alpha generation, which is anyone who's 2 and under. Well, let's just focus on the millennials, shall we? Otherwise, we'll lose the plot. So I've gone through and sort of talked about the history and the millennials and who they are. What is the global and UK impact? Well, in the UK, as I've said, there are about 15 million millennials, slightly less than some countries. In the USA, there are about 92 million. And I think the view is, as I said earlier, that by 2020, half of the global workforce will be millennials. But what's really interesting, and for those who work in global businesses, and let's be honest, we are in a highly cosmopolitan global world and a country. 90% of millennials currently live in the developing regions, and they have high unemployment. Africa is one example. The biggest city in Africa is Lagos in Nigeria, with something like 20 million people. A high proportion of those people living in Lagos are millennials, highly connected but unemployed. By 2020, half of India's population will be under 25. And what's also interesting is 25% of global millennials don't currently speak English at home. That trend is increasing given the numbers I've explained about the developing world. So there are lots of reasons to take millennials seriously from a global perspective. But what this is really about is trying to see how we can understand them better to benefit our business, to potentially attract and retain the best talent, and to maximize the potential of those millennials we have working with us and by us. One of the primary things that comes out of and all the research we do through the Millennial Jury is about control. And we'll pick up on that theme, and Camilla will pick up on that theme as we go along. But control is something I want to place now in your heads, because that is what millennials want. They want to control their lives. And I would say in Generation X and baby boomers weren't able to control their lives the way millennials can, and didn't try to control their lives because they felt they shouldn't. So that's a key, I think, differentiator of millennials. I'll come back finally to say cynicism and skepticism. I would say now we've been doing the Millennial Jury for 2.5 years, 2 years. And I would say 60 to 70% of the people we talk to directly about it at board level in UK businesses, and some in US, but not as much, are still either cynical or skeptical. And we take pride in trying to change that perception, and we usually can. So I'm now going to move on to the next slide, unless Chester's got any questions for me at this stage.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Yeah, we've actually had a couple of questions that have come in. One talking around their experience that millennial change seems to come in from the slightly younger generation, kind of sub 28 to 16. So keen just to get your perspective on the stretch of the generation. But actually, the question that's really being asked is to what extent is this just extended? So my question is this just extended teenage angst dragged into adulthood by the digital world, or is there actually something fundamentally different going on within this generation?
Okay, that's a great question. I mean, I can feel the parenting angst coming from the questioner, whoever it may be. But look, we sort of, there's quite a lot in that question. I'll answer the bit about micro segmentation within the cohort. That sounds marketing speak. What I'm trying to say is when you've got, I don't know, 15 years or so as a segment, there will be some changes in that, especially as that does tend to straddle home ownership, working, and critically parenting. What all of the research we've shown is that the biggest change point in that generational shift is parenting. Workplace is changing. Millennials have adapted to, and Camilla will pick up on this later in the presentation. Millennials have made work their work for them. Millennials are delaying big expenditure like houses, but when they live in a house and if they rent, they will write their own rules to that. They're not obeying to the previous rules. But one thing we have seen is that parenting softens their selfishness. We did some amazing research just before Christmas looking at the perceptions of Christmas by millennials, and we split two groups. We had two groups, and it was split between those living at home pre-children and those pre-children and those as parents. And it was all about the parenting was putting more emphasis on the children, as you'd expect, but it softened the millennial selfishness and the expenditure. But what they were doing was sort of living their millennial lives then through their children. And one of the things we've noticed is they're also creating their own rules around parenting. So a good example would be a baby boomer or a Generation X wouldn't dream of putting an iPad up in a restaurant, an expensive restaurant, with a baby in a high chair and let them watch Peppa Pig while they were enjoying their fine dining. It just wouldn't have happened. Millennial parents are having their own lives and keeping them, being less selfish, but they're certainly not going to stop having fun. The final point I would say there is the link, to answer your question, the link to all this is tech. That's the single thing that changes the dynamic for millennials and makes it much more important than any other generation. It's not about teenage angst, this is about control. It's about a group of people who understand tech and are making it change the world they live in. I can sense that I probably over-answered that question, so I'm now moving on to a bit about the influence, fields of influence from millennials.
Yeah, it would be really useful, Rob, if you could just expand kind of on that influence across different business sectors, because we definitely have a large number of different industries represented on the webinar today.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So firstly, I'll just say that the Flat White Economy, for those who haven't read it, and I don't financially benefit from this plug here, but great book written in 2015 by some economists, a guy called Douglas McWilliams who wrote it. And, you know, one of the killer sort of stats around the book, the first 100 pages are absolutely engaging. It then gets into some pretty heavy economic data, which I didn't find as easy. But the killer stat was his realization that between 2012 and 2014, bear in mind, this was in the aftermath of the banking crisis as we remember it, 32,000 startup businesses were formed in one single postcode in London. And for the similar time period, that was the equivalent of all of the startups being set up in both Manchester and Newcastle versus one single postcode in London. And that postcode, as some of you may have guessed, is EC1V, which is Old Street roundabout in Shoreditch. And anyone who knows and understands that area, and we take a lot of clients to this area using a tool called Smart Safari, which takes them to businesses, all not food-led at all, all different businesses, to sort of get their heads around how millennials are disrupting and creating new business ventures. But the whole disruption approach, for me, is all around how the status quo has been turned around or disrupted by the use of tech. those 32,000 businesses were set up were all tech marketing businesses and tech-related businesses. What was fascinating was the book explains the correlation between those businesses arriving in Shoreditch and the increase of coffee consumption, hence the title Flat White Economy, versus beer, the increase of backpacks versus briefcases, the increase of bike ownership versus other forms of travel, etc., etc. So it had a knock-on effect to the economy in the area, and that has now spread out into places like Bristol and Nottingham, etc. Camilla's going to come on later to talk about how the workplace has changed, which I think is very interesting. But in terms of disruption, you know, you'll know about the media disruption, you'll know about accommodation. I'll just sort of quote one thing which I think really chimes well with this whole story, which is the world's largest taxi company owns no vehicles. The world's most popular media owner creates no content. The most valuable retailer has no inventory, and the world's largest accommodation provider owns no real estate. So if we're still feeling skeptical or cynical, then I would say that's a hell of a change in a short period of time. And Uber, Facebook, Alibaba, and Airbnb are only some of the companies that have had tremendous growth and will continue to grow because they're super relevant due to the millennials. I'll just quickly tell you a story about transport, because I think this may chime with some of you if you're in the sort of same generation as me. I constantly find it amusing to have a black cab ride in London and see if the cabbie is going to start talking about Uber. I sometimes sort of prompt it, and I've never had the experience where they've never not discussed Uber in the same tone. Yet it was only, and their frustration is paramount. It's all about unbelievable. They're not registered. It's not safe. There are now 90,000 in London. There weren't any before Boris took over. Their business is on its knees, etc., etc., etc. What I never hear about them is what they're going to do to evolve and what they're going to do for consumers. And it was only the week before Christmas of this year that black cabs all adopted the contactless payment. Up until then, you've probably experienced a black cab driver with it all mask taped over the paying system. And still they don't offer iPhone chargers, free water, air conditioning, let alone chewing gum or mints or anything else that could make the consumer experience better. And if you want to sit there in peace and quiet, it's quite hard to do. Quite apart from the technical advances. So one of the interesting things for me is it's often cited as a great example of disruption. I think it's actually probably the most easy piece of disruption that's ever taken place because of the lack of evolution and forward thinking by that group of business. I'm now going to pass over to Camilla, who's going to talk a bit about the disruption of the food and drink sector that we're most experienced in. So over to you, Camilla.
Thanks, Rob. Obviously, from a food and drink perspective, the disruption hasn't been quite so marked because there's less technology involved. But we are seeing a huge influx of innovation. Small businesses are being able to come into what are established markets. Fever Tree last year, I think, was one of the best performing shares as a new tonic water into what could have been deemed an almost unbreaking into type category, with Schweppes and Own Label really owning that space entirely. You're now seeing new businesses are now coming into that space so that they can start to have an impact. You're seeing that in all sorts of different categories, but at the same time, you're seeing how technology is beginning to get into this space. While online groceries growing at roughly 7% year on year, you're also seeing the transition of businesses like Amazon saying we can also play in this market. And we will look regularly at how Amazon Fresh is breaking into that space. But all these different things that we've learned with the millennials and their attitudes towards different businesses and industries is marked by the work we've been doing with Millennial Jury. So Rob, you're going to go on to talk about that?
Thank you, Camilla. Thank you for that. So the Millennial Jury, we launched this in 2015 on the back of seeing so many of the industry leaders not just being cynical and skeptical about millennials, but actually just ignoring them. And actually at this stage, I would say over 50% of the CEOs that I spoke to and the board members of our clients actually weren't aware of what millennials were. So we wanted to create a way in which they could have access and learn more from millennials. I would say at front end here that there are two types of research, qual and quant. The obsession with quantitative research, whilst I've been in the industry over the last 25, 27 years, has always surprised me. And in fact, it's interesting to see over the last year that the forecasting, numerical forecasting, quant research industry is under severe pressure because no amount of people that you ask questions of, no amount of money you invest can actually guarantee an answer, can actually give you 100% de-risking of a strategy. For me, as we grow more accustomed to our industry, if we are wise and look outside enough, we should be very capable of making these decisions with some directional support from qual. And the Millennial Jury really could never be quant. Whilst we have occasionally done panels of 2,000-3,000, in essence, it's about understanding the nuances and the directions of the language we hear from millennials to support our instinct. Because what we have learnt about millennials is you can't hoard them, you can't herd them into groups, and they're very smart. They know their value, and they can be contradictory. And when you look at trying to do the 8 out of 10 cats owners say, it falls down. And what I think is fascinating is Brexit, American election, banking forecasts, failures. All of that points to the fact that we mustn't over-rely on quant. So we've done about over 1,000 hours of millennial insights. Primarily, we call it a jury, primarily in a kind of, we think, a super engaged panel. And looking at the supermarkets as a start point, it's fascinating to see the perception of millennial consumers versus core. We tend to do core being 35 and above. I sometimes probably stopping at around 70. So it straddles baby boomers and Generation X. And when we contrast that with millennials, it's fascinating to see the differences. There is a lot of dissatisfaction from millennials for supermarkets and the experience. They see it as a chore. By the way, we did some research on coffee shops recently, and they see Costa similarly to Tesco's. So millennials see Costa as a top up. It's there, it's prevalent, it'll do me a coffee, but I don't love it. I'm not engaged with it. It's not a brand I love. The same will be for Tesco. Yet the generation above, my generation, pretty amazed by Costa because it came on the back of some crap coffee. Supermarkets are seeing a decline in loyalty take-up from millennials on loyalty cards because they're just not engaged by the whole supermarket experience. And you know what? They will continue to be less engaged because it's a chore, and they'll buy their products online and they'll have them delivered because they would rather spend time with their friends doing the things they want rather than going around a supermarket. I think the supermarkets understand that, but they're challenged because they've got to meet a number of other cohorts' needs. Restaurants, on the other hand, are thriving because of millennials. So if you take New York, where really the ownership of kitchens is low in comparison to, say, London, most millennials will eat out regularly. And that pattern is increasing in London and in cities around the UK. Young people enjoy the experience restaurants give that supermarkets don't, and brilliant brands have adapted to that. Be it in the QSR sector, McDonald's versus Five Guys. The benefits are commercially there to be seen. Essentially, yes, the quality is different and the experience is slightly different, but Five Guys have managed to sell burgers to millennials for £8 to £10 and keep them waiting longer, while McDonald's struggle to get above £4 and get it quicker than you need. So for me, this is about how do you understand millennials and how does it work to your business? Wagamama, Byron Burger, and I mentioned Five Guys are all great examples. There are many, many more where businesses are thriving by understanding what young people want and giving it to them. The beer market, very quickly, one of our clients, Carlsberg UK, we're helping them understand how they market towards millennials in the cities. And it is fascinating because their brand, Carlsberg, is not resonating with millennials, but they have brands within their portfolio that do. And it's a mindset change. And it's we're currently in a marketplace where it's easier for a millennial craft beer company to succeed in a supermarket with getting a listing than it is for Carlsberg to be able to get their products away in a supermarket, despite the amount of money they will offer. So there's a real opportunity, I think, in that sector. I'm now going to hand over to Camilla because I don't want to kind of just make this all FMCG focused, but she's going to talk about health. We have a client that has an emerging health brand that comes from Australia. She'll build on that, but she's also going to talk about brands and how health and brands, the insights we've seen through our Millennial Jury. So over to you, Camilla.
Thanks, Rob. What we found looking at Chia and a number of other healthy brands or health brands or nutritional brands, health has become a generic term for an attitude of mind. It's cool to be fit. It's cool to look trim. It is totally acceptable for millennials to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning so they can get a really good session in the gym before they go to work. It is seen as an achievement to be off certain foods for certain times of the year. It's an achievement to understand about nutrition and care about your body. You're seeing a massive rise in awareness of prevention, but also about discussion of topics that would never, ever, ever have been discussed. So about 15 years ago, when I was working for a PR company, we were looking at how we could get men to talk about men's health. And we had a huge brainstorming session and came up with the idea of a Haynes manual. So this idea that we could have a Haynes manual to men's health. Nowadays, you've got people actively, overtly walking down the street to support Movember. Everybody's sponsoring each other. It's being discussed in the office. It is an open discussion. It's not a taboo subject anymore. Health is something people want to actively talk about and show that they care. You're seeing a huge involvement with Just Giving pages, and this brings the social side into things. So you're not just talking about health within the confines of the home, you're talking about health with your friends, with your family, with your community, as well as within the office space. So what we've been learning with the Millennial Jury is the work that health is about an attitude of mind. It's about being able to understand where health fits within your life. So we did some work with a brand, Sun-Made raisins. You may know them, you may not know them. Most people know them from when they were really quite small, and their mother would give them little boxes, little red boxes with the Jesus-looking creature on the front. It's not Jesus, it's a woman. These people, during the Millennial Jury, were talking about the idea that they knew that raisins were a healthier option than sweets or crisps or chocolate. They recognized that it had natural sugars within it, but they also recognized that it was better for them. And they knew that that would be a good way for it to fit within their life. We have all sorts of brands that look at the Millennial Jury. Millennials look at brands in a very different way to perhaps the way that we look at brands as me being a slightly older generation. We got brands like Sun-Made. We did some work with Drake's, which is a jewelry business. We realized quite early on that the attitude towards diamonds or jewelry or spending significant amounts of money on jewelry as opposed to trinkets, this was an engagement ring. It had a reason to be on your hand for the rest of your life. It really mattered. What we realized was the brand was almost as important as the product. The experience of going to that shop, being in that shop, having that customer service relationship with that individual was significantly important to this consumer group, which slightly flies in the face of our understanding of how they buy online. There is no personal relationship. It's a relationship with Amazon. You click, you get it the next day. It's a relationship with online shopping. You pick what you want. You don't have to walk around the aisles. You don't have to indulge in the brands. So when brands really make a difference is when millennials want to engage directly with a product through the brand, or when they have brands that they trust and they love. So Amazon, they know how it works, they know how it happens, they trust it. They're all eagerly waiting to see how Amazon Fresh is going to work because they've always shopped through Amazon. They know how it works, so the next bit will work well too. So they engage in a completely different way with brands in the way that they do with own label. That having been said, the brands realize the power of this consumer group. So if you look at how brands are trying to get into the working space, or how brands are engaging with millennials in the working space, you understand how organizations like co-working spaces have become hotbeds for brands to really get involved. So Chester, if you click on to the next slide, what we found is that co-working spaces were really, I mean, they've been around for a long time, but they were sort of set up in 2005 in the format that we know them today. And these co-working spaces were set up originally really in San Francisco with this concept that the business centers were unsociable and communities needed to be generated where business could become synergistic. So organizations could learn from each other, they could be more social, and it could really build a very different environment. Since 2005, by 2012, 2013, there are over 3,000 spaces across the globe, accommodating over 100,000 people. So it's a real boom, and this is reflective of this particular consumer group. So you're looking at a space where small businesses can come and share best practice with other small businesses. You're looking at a hub for creativity and innovation. So the co-working space can offer advice and support. And as a result, you get this kind of incubator type setup. So as a result of that, the co-working spaces, like one we've had a lot to do with is a business called Huckletree. And Huckletree is based in London. They're very much an innovation technology-based co-working space. And what they do is they offer support service to like-minded businesses, whether it's health technology, whether it's accountancy, or true technology with design and computer work. There's a whole mixture of stuff going on. So as a result, you're seeing this sign up of these like-minded businesses who want to be part of that. They have to buy into the social space, so they have to be part of the community before they can participate. And as a result, you're finding very strong, like-minded, influential people getting into one environment. And as a result, brands want to come and play in that part. So you're seeing this kind of hotbed of influential key opinion leaders, trend leading individuals, and brands say, oh, we'd like to be in that space. How can you build us into that? So they're finding different ways of getting in, whether that's being a beer on tap, whether that's being a freemium, so something in there that could be free to anyone who happens to work within the co-working space, or whether they can start being the older brother, offering advice and support with mentoring and apprenticeship type dynamics. But what we found is when we spend time at Huckletree, this particular group don't treat food in the same way as perhaps we did when we were living in London as, startups. The concept of grabbing a sandwich and a cup of coffee is different now. Food matters, health matters. They spend more time looking after themselves. So they spend 20 minutes making a new salad. It's all fresh. It's all good for them. It's got seeds. It's got nuts. It's all really interesting. And as a result, brands are saying, right, how can we play in that space? We'll give you some coconut water and you can try our products. You can talk about it and you can share it. That demonstrates how you can get this sort of entrepreneurial attitude. So you've got this concept that anyone can set up a business with very little money, and as a result you can get to the this space where new businesses come up, new ideas come up, and with the new rules that millennials are looking for, authenticity, sustainability, it's all making a real difference to the world that they live in. So Rob, do you want to explain a bit more about the behavior that we've come across with Carlsberg trying to get into this co-working space?
Yeah, very, very quickly. I think we're kind of conscious that we've got to kind of move on, much as we're passionate about this subject. Yeah, I mean, Carlsberg, McDonald's, they've all deliberately sought out this space to gain associated brand value, but it's more than that. KPMG went to Huckletree, Camilla mentioned Huckletree, one of our partners, and said, look, we would like to be involved in this. We want to be at the center of this tech revolution with all these young millennials. And they said, well, no, we're not going to have KPMG in here. Why would we? And the deal was done based on it being KPMG's innovation hub. And it was only the innovation hub that were allowed to be there. But all these businesses are doing it for the reasons of association, but also, and this is the key link, because they're going to be rubbing shoulders with tremendous talent. Some people who are very bright, very driven, very motivated, can bridge marketing, selling, economics, everything in one package. And they're already hoping to recruit these people. So that's, I think, one of the benefits of the workplace. I'll pass you back to Camilla.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I mean, I think what we're seeing is there's a very different attitude to the way that millennials look at work per se. They want to get the work-life balance right. They need to be able to get something back. I'm coming to your office every day. What's in it for me? You're seeing the Google building being a much more conducive social space. This idea that millennials, we're privileged for millennials to work in our organizations, but actually some of that is about how they're disrupting the office space. Why should we sit in boxes? Why should we sit in open spaces? Why should we sit in physical chairs and desks? Why should we have meeting rooms where there are tables and chairs where people have to sit? No, we want meeting rooms where there are no tables and chairs, which mean meetings last for 5 minutes, not 25 minutes. And as a result, it's changing it's opening our mind to different ways of working. I think that having been said, you're also finding that money matters. So they want the work-life balance, but they need to make money. And perhaps naively, they've been led to believe, growing up with, as Rob said, organizations like Facebook and Instagram and Google, you're seeing enormous businesses appearing overnight and people being incredibly rich, really in their youth. And why shouldn't everybody have that? With Pop Idol, The Voice, all these people being spotted, the lottery, they're growing up with these almost Willy Wonka type opportunities, and why shouldn't that happen to all of us? I think also what you're finding is that a lot of it's becoming secret cost. So it's one thing to be trying to put your foot on the housing ladder. That's a huge amount of money. And obviously, as we all know, it's getting harder and harder for people to get on the housing ladder. That having been said, they don't bat an eyelid to blow 2K on a new MacBook, because as far as they're concerned, that's a necessity. Well, it's quite hard to save if that's what you're spending every 3 years on simple things like technology. At the same time, you're also spending money on online subscriptions. Not online subscriptions for newspapers or magazines. You're talking about software updates. You're talking about iTunes. You're talking about Spotify. You're talking about streaming TV. This is all cost that they very much see as a necessity. As a result, you're seeing the working environment having to catch up. So you're getting mobile phones, you're getting data bundles, all of this becomes standard practice when you go and get a job. You're looking for conducive environments. You're looking for this instant gratification and quick wins, which is pretty tough when you're a 25-year-old who's starting at the bottom of the career, expecting to make an impact and turn over a work-life balance overnight.
Camilla,
Ian, I think
Camilla,
you're obviously...
Camilla, can I ask you a question then from taking on new recruits? We've got a question from Edwards, which is a biomedical company, and the question is around the type of individuals that they bring into the workplace. Traditionally, they've brought in people that can speak with a clinical background and need to be able to socially interact with doctors and cardiac surgeons. I guess the question that's come in is around, would it be a gamble to be bringing in people with these new types of outlooks on life that might be seen as leading edge and more malleable, versus the kind of safety of hiring somebody with a more traditional, they know what to do type mindset?
That's an interesting question, Chester. I think there are two parts to this question. The first one is, as I'm sure that the question the person who asked the question knows, how much work is done with patient groups? How much work is done with people who have experienced illnesses, work with some of the medical devices, take certain drugs? It's about sharing experience, and none of those people have, or I'm assuming most of those people don't have medical backgrounds, but they're best placed to sell. There is an attitude that we go for expertise. Obviously, there's always a place for expertise, but it potentially opens our minds to different ways of doing things if you are prepared to take the risk in talking to millennials or talking to the consumer group that you're targeting to better understand how they want to be spoken to. It's about a language, it's about a way of communicating. And there's always, you can teach skill of how to sell, how to communicate with clinicians or patient groups, but they perhaps might open the mind to approach it in a different way. There may be a different way of communicating, a different mechanism, whether that's using technology, using video, using face-to-face, or whether that's actually producing materials, leaflets, booklets in different languages. And I don't mean foreign languages, I mean how you talk about these things. If you talk about Movember, people know what you're talking about. If you actually break that down into what the men's health subjects are, a lot of people won't actually know. So there may be an opportunity to consider what they might bring to that table.
Sure, and I think that therefore reflects on who are you trying to talk to, and therefore how are you trying to recruit against messages and bringing in that innovative and creative thinking of the younger generation. Ian, I know that creativity is something that's close to your heart. Maybe I might just ask you to take us through some of the creative elements of the Millennial Jury.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, obviously, I've employed sort of millennials in the creative process for forever, basically. And yeah, I've seen a huge change in the last 27 years in terms of how people approach becoming creative. And we've talked a lot about how technology plays a massive role with the millennials. And to be honest, I've seen, you know, sort of people draw inspiration and creativity from technology, particularly in the last sort of 10 years. And when you look at some of the sort of massive ideas out there that have kind of been the sort of big creative pushes, they've come from being inspired by technology. And you know, I'm obviously talking about the sort of you know, the Apples and the Googles, the Ubers, and you know, all those other technology-driven industries that have been incredibly creative in their thinking, inspired by the technology and the importance of technology with the millennial generation. So in terms of sort of the permission to be creative, I mean, this sort of frustrates me a bit in the respect that people can say to me, "Oh, Ian, you're so creative." Actually, I think creativity should come into absolutely every single sort of industry out there, whether it's medical or technology or whatever it is, or whether it's accountancy. It really doesn't matter. Creativity is all about using your imagination to create something new. So in a recent survey that I saw, only 2.5% of companies actually are deemed to be innovators. The rest are either sort of slow followers or quick followers or whatever. So there's only 2.5% of companies actually out there innovating and being creative in their thinking. So my point really is that absolutely everybody listening to this and everybody in your organization should sort of take a creative lead in how they think. Now, I suppose the biggest problem is actually sort of managing those creatives, and actually how do you get a creative idea out of people who point blank say, "Well, I'm not a creative, you know, I'm definitely not creative." Well, okay, I disagree. I've met people on reception desks that have come up with the most fantastic ideas, or people who just work in the kitchen who suddenly come up with an amazing idea that changes the way that business is run. And so for me, you know, if you were struggling within your organization to sort of get creative, so to speak, then get some people in. I mean, we quite often, in terms of myself, Rob and Camilla, will go in and help extract that creative thinking out of a team that might be a bit sterile and stuck in their ways. I suppose the biggest sort of challenge in terms of creativity is one, knowing how to start, two, knowing how to kind of channel that thinking into a great sort of solution, and then finally knowing when to stop. I know when you know, I used to do a lot of painting, it was actually knowing when to stop, but that was actually the most difficult thing. And I don't know if you can see on my slide, it says creative process. I've seen this process in terms of you know, God, what a brilliant idea, and then you suddenly hit the brick wall of, actually this is a bit tricky, and then you go, oh my God, you lose confidence and it becomes all shit, and oh my God, I'm shit, and then you sort of suddenly take it personally, and then all of a sudden, oh, actually this might be okay, this might be awesome. And that's where the magic spark comes from. And in terms of sort of trying to get to a point where you've got a group of people being creative around something, it's about actually somebody going, that's an awesome idea. And anybody, literally anybody, can have a creative, awesome idea. Sometimes you just need, you know, great people around you to be able to kind of shape that idea and actually translate it into something magical. So, I mean, in terms of sort of, if you are sort of looking to sort of engage people in some sort of brainstorm or whatever it might be, definitely get people in who aren't necessarily experts in their industry. And that relates back to the question about, should I employ somebody who's kind of got the old school knowledge, or should I, employ somebody who's actually sort of a bit more sort of light-footed and a bit more open to the thinking. And I think Camilla said, well, it's kind of horses for courses, but actually you need a blend of everything in terms of sort of changing your working environments. And when you think about how, if you embrace creativity properly, how it can actually really disrupt an industry, there are endless examples of industries that have been recently disrupted, primarily through the use of technology. And Rob mentioned, sort of Facebook and Amazon and Uber, but we see it in other industries. We recently visited Force India, Formula One racing team, and how they have used creative thinking to completely disrupt how they did things in the pit lane, etc. Just rethinking, how could we do this more effectively by using highly creative thinking, and everybody getting into a room and going, right, how could we do this better? And somebody then translating that into sort of really high actionable plans. And I think one of the key things I'm probably going to sort of say is be open-minded in terms of using creativity. And once you find, yes, sorry.
Yeah, and we have a question here around, you mentioned technology there, and Rob mentioned it right at the head of the webinar. Do you believe that technology needs to lie at the heart of communicating with millennials then in this creative capacity?
Hey, look, when I ran the agency, it used to frustrate the hell out of me when I give a brief and the first thing the creative would do was jump on their Mac and try and find a solution in the Mac. For me, the inspiration shouldn't come from the technology. The technology should help deliver the solution. So, I guess you need a foundation in terms of what your tools can do. So perhaps when the guys were coming up with the idea of Uber, they knew the potential in terms of what could be done through technology, handheld devices, etc. But probably the big idea came to them either in the middle of the night or in a pub, or actually sat around a table without any technology. So it's kind of a balance between using humans, talking to humans, actually coming up with ideas, and whether that's in the pub or out in the park or whatever, and then using your technology to execute that creative idea right through to the last detail. And you've got to give Uber their due. They've thought about every touch point along that journey, whether it's the technology side of things or whether it's the in-cab experience that you might have, and that Rob alluded to. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, definitely for me. Rob, I guess conscious of time and people having to step off to other meetings, could I just ask you to maybe just to draw kind of some of your key points and actions to from where you guys have come from earlier? Yeah,
absolutely. And look, thank you for the questions that I've had through from you guys. I've tried to answer them. It's a bit hard to do it in full. So 3 main points we talked about at the beginning. Understanding millennials better. Well, hopefully we've done a bit of that. Stressing taking their needs a bit more seriously, but you've got to understand what their needs are really to do that. And then try and think about developing a strategic mindset, which I think has been discussed throughout this. But I guess it's more important to talk about the 3 key actions. We could give 10 actions, but our recommendation would be do things that are going to give you a competitive advantage. I'll flip the cynicism and skepticism point on its head, but I would say to you that skepticism and cynicism are an advantage to the open-minded, because if your competitor remains cynical and skeptical about millennials, then it allows you to grab that space. So,
how much keys did you have?
First key action.
Have you?
Empower your millennials within a framework.
You haven't had any lunch.
Empower the millennials within a framework. So that allows you to really test them, give them a challenge, but put them at the heart of it. the one reason, and you may have seen this from your own HR surveys, the one reason millennials leave so quickly from jobs these days is because they're not making a difference. They're not taken seriously. They don't have a say. That's easy to fix. Morrisons are introducing a system, which is quite interesting, which is going to give a lot more empowerment to their younger people. But boy, they're going to have to deliver on it, and it'll be within a framework. But the people there will feel very free compared to some other retailers, which are more hierarchical. Leverage the millennials' tech skills. The key point about tech is, and to sort of answer that question from my perspective, yes. I think you do need to use tech to communicate. I think in selling, it's going to play a bigger part. I think the tech is going to do more of the selling. The individual is going to do the relationship building. So the tech is going to be used for salespeople to do their administration more efficiently, to allow them to work more on strategy and thinking and ideas. And I think it is the heart of all this, and it will only increase. You know, I've spoken to Generation X salespeople, and they've just laughed at me when I've said, guys, a national account manager visiting a supermarket is going to be a thing of the past. It just will happen. Information will be given to the retailers directly via cloud, and therefore you've got to maximize your relationships and make them relevant. And I think the biggest challenge in HR is going to be, at what stage do we kind of accept that when we're interviewing a millennial, they're not going to be as sophisticated and as socially aware as maybe we wanted them to be based on perceptions of a different generation? If we were to dismiss people based on that thinking, and we may well have lost great talent who can deliver stuff technically, and maybe in a world of millennials where it wasn't as important. That's an interesting one. I don't see any open debate in that arena. And then finally, I think we should look at rewarding millennials differently. You know, someone questioned quite rightly about the house pricing. No one can afford houses. They haven't got the money. Camilla's made the great point about, well, actually, they're still spending money on things, probably their parents' money, on things like iPads and things like that. Their perception on things are differently. They may not want to be the next finance director. They may want to be running their own finance package online. They may be very happy working as a financial manager, not a director. We've got to treat them differently and reward them differently and come up with things that are different. And, you know, this whole work-life balance thing that we talk about in my generation, I don't think they understand what that means, the millennials. There are so many big differences when we look at the Millennial Jury and contrast two different generations. It is staggering to see how different perceptions are. And I think if we take that learning into how we reward and incentivize, I think again there's a competitive advantage. My final sign off, I know we probably overrun before we do any Q&A, is please don't misunderstand me. This is not about the millennials in isolation and forgetting everyone else. The country still very much, economy still very much runs on Generation X and baby boomers. I think baby boomers and Generation X have adopted a lot of the behaviors of millennials. I don't think millennials have adopted the generations of their forebears. So we're not trying to suggest we all act like millennials. What we're saying is we help clients make sense of them, make a strategy for them, and gain differentiation and commercial value and competitive advantage from doing so. And that's I guess the end of our three key actions. I'll hand you back to Chester because I think hopefully this time we may be taking some questions if we've got any.
Well, I think we are up against it for time, but it looks like most people have stayed online because they're engaged with the subject. So I am actually going to just cover off, whilst people are wrapping up, the things that are coming up in the future. First, I just wanted to thank the three of you for your inputs. We will distribute your email addresses for those that want to ask further questions and come back to you in person on everything they've heard. From an Uspire community perspective, we have a number of different events coming up, and I'm sure that Rob, Camilla and Ian may well be at those and would like to come along, and I'm sure you can pick up with them in person. So we have a category management symposium, which is for Uspire members on the 2nd of February. We have a webinar in 2 months' time in March on landing price increases. And if you are an Uspire member, I would urge you to look to make space in April. The 4th of April will be in Dublin, looking at how people use their EQ in terms of group facilitation. And if you are an Uspire member or want to be an Uspire member, which we're quite happy to talk to you about, then make the 4th of April a date that you should be looking to get in your diaries. So without further ado, I just wanted to thank our panelists. I wanted to thank Rob, Camilla and Ian for coming on board. If you want to discuss anything more about adapting the strategies or finding more about the network, then please send either myself or a note. The addresses are here, and we can share that with you. So thank you very much for the audience. Maybe they'd like to say goodbye in person without me. It's further ado. Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Thank you.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.